they're singing.
My creator of heaven and earth, I believe in Jesus Christ, his only Son, and our Lord, who was conceived by the Holy Spirit, born of the Virgin Mary, suffered under Pontius Pilate, was crucified, died, and was buried. He descended to the dead. On the third day he arose again. He ascended into heaven, is seated at the right hand of the Father, and will come again to judge the living and the dead. I believe in the Holy Spirit, the Holy Catholic Church, the communion of saints, the forgiveness of sins, the resurrection of the body, and the life everlasting. Amen. So with you. Peace be with you. Peace be with you.
I would love to have dinner sometime. That would be great. That would be great. I'm in my head at least. I'm not really doing anything at the moment, but I'm actively seeking more opportunities with different people and trying to. It just feels like that's something I ought to do. And so.
These two spotlights right here. Should we bring those down a little bit? These two lights.
This is where we'll see you soon. Thanks.
Within the wilderness, rest upon the way, from the burning of the noontide heat, burden of the day. Upon the cross of Jesus, at times can see a very tiny.
All right, good morning, everyone. Welcome to Forum. Sorry we're running a little bit behind schedule, but that'll be okay. We'll be sure to give Rob our full allotted time. When am I back? I hear some singing again, Sid. Okay. Nope, I hear the music. I'm not sure where that's coming from. We have some. All right. I swear that's not me singing. Huh, that's a new problem. We're accustomed to having technical challenges at Forum. This is a new one. I'm sure that our capable hands. That'll just be some interesting background. I like that. That's a good attitude. So quick announcements here. The next 2 weeks there will be no Forum. We've got Palm Sunday, of course, and then Easter. So 2-week break. And then the third week from now, it's April 16th, we'll have Dr. Maggie Gaddis, come to talk about making a transition to native plants in honor of Earth Day. So you don't want to miss that one. Okay, so that brings us to today. I'm really excited to have Rob Rogers with us. Rob Rogers is a veteran of the U.S. Air Force. He was a candidate for Colorado House of Representatives last year. Rob has been actively involved in campaigns and activism, particularly around the topic of separation of church and state, as well as school board activities and so forth. He's a member of organizations like Freedom from Religion Foundation and the American Atheists. He's dedicated to promoting secularism and defending the rights of non-religious individuals. So let's give a welcome to Rob Rogers.
Thanks for letting me be here today. It's interesting, and I ended up leaving in my membership in those organizations, not to be disrespectful, but just to let you all know that I appreciate you, and I look for allies wherever that I can find them. Because with the threats that we're facing in today's society from Christian nationalism and other extremists, if you're not a Christian nationalist, then you are the enemy. So you are all my allies, and I appreciate you even in inviting me here to help you understand a little bit more about something called the Seven Mountains. Now, there's no way that I'm ever going to be able to comprehensively cover the entirety of this ideology in the time that we have today. So what I'm going to try to do today is just to give you some examples, basically give you some patterns, kind of show you what's been happening with this ideology, and explain a little bit about how, whether or not you knew it, El Paso County and Colorado Springs are the epicenter for this particular movement and the threat that it faces. We're going to talk about some local examples, and then I'll give you some examples at the national level, just so you can start to be exposed and so you can start to understand these things whenever you see them. That makes sense. I do talk about the fact that I am an Air Force veteran because I don't really fit the mold. A lot of people, will have certain opinions about military or veterans, but I did serve in the Air Force for 9 years, and I'm very proud of what I was able to do, while I was there. And I do appreciate the military community, but I also don't necessarily fit the mold either. So I like to point that out. I have been involved with Freedom from Religion Foundation and American Atheists for quite some time. This is not a new thing for me. I've been tracking Christian nationalism activities for about the last 12 years. So I can't really call myself an expert, from an academic perspective. I've never been published or anything, but I have been tracking this for quite some time. And like I said, this is something that is a threat for both believers and non-believers. So we're definitely allies in this particular respect. I did run for state representative in 2022. The reason why I mentioned that is because I think it's a good example about how the county is changing. I ran in House District 14. House District 14 is probably one of the most Republican districts in the county. It's also the home for most of these Christian nationalist organizations that I'm going to mention today, the most prominent of which is probably focused on the family. And I still was able to get to a 60-40 split in that district. So things are changing is my point. I point that out not as being arrogant, but to be encouraging. Things are changing in the county. And then last time, I also just want to mention too that I am now the first vice chair of the the county Democratic Party as of February. That's also, I think, should be encouraging for people who are afraid, of these things, who do value pluralism. Because the first vice chair of the El Paso County Democrats is here talking with all of you about white Christian nationalism in El Paso County, Colorado. So that's also an example about how things are changing. I also just like to mention in forums like this, there's a very specific reason that I do this. I'm also an alcoholic. I've been in recovery since September 26th of 2011. The reason why I talk about this publicly is because stigma kills. It needs to be normal to talk about people who have addiction problems because there's nothing wrong with me any more than there's someone who is in recovery from cancer or for some kind of heart disease. So whenever you're out there and you do see people who are obviously struggling with addiction issues, just remember they didn't choose that life. that no one would ever choose that life. So remember to approach that with more compassion, maybe more understanding than what we might do as a society, because stigma does kill and we need to reduce that stigma. So I want to tell a story today about how all this happened, and I'm really, really happy that my friend Melissa is here today, because I couldn't have done like any of this without her. This all started, I moved to Colorado Springs in 2018. I've been traveling out here quite a bit for a while. And then when I moved out in 2018, I knew that Colorado Springs and El Paso County was a very religious, a very conservative county. I didn't really realize exactly how extensive that was until the school board elections in 2021. And that's whenever all the local school boards were taken over by conservative extremists. That was done with the help of $180,000 of dark money. This whole journey, this whole thing that I'm about to explain about what we discovered, all started with that. Where there were nine of the candidates, you probably all know who I'm talking about, 9 candidates that were supported with $180,000 of dark money. And when that dark money was provided by a 501c6 trade organization called Colorado Springs Forward. All of this started by trying to figure out where that came from. Where did that money come from? And it took us a long time in order to figure that out, and we finally actually did get an answer to that question, but it wasn't really what we expected. But that's what triggered all of the questions that we started having. There was a big red herring right up front. We went down the wrong path at first, because a lot of you might know like how influential that something called the Church Voters Guide was during city council elections and then during the school board elections in 2021. So we were thinking that because of how influential that Church Voters Guide was, that maybe that was the source of the money. Maybe they found some way of like hiding that. The Road to Chapel Hills, their public policy team, which it's still weird to me to say out loud that a church has a public policy team, they are the ones who published the Church Voters Guide. They were not the ones who provided the money, but that's still what led us down this path, because it started opening up as we were doing research into church involvement in elections locally and within the city. It started opening up all of the other things that were related to that, and that's how we discovered that Colorado Springs and El Paso County is actually a hub for this activity. Colorado Springs is actually the 4th largest faith-based economy in the United States. Anyone want to take a guess at what number 1 is, just to give you an idea of the scale? Number 1 faith-based economy in the United States is Salt Lake City, Utah. Wouldn't make sense, right? But now think about that. Think about how much the state of Utah is controlled by the LDS Church, and now think about the fact that Colorado Springs is the 4th largest. The other 2 are North Carolina and Tennessee, which also shouldn't be surprising. There's more than 50 Christian nonprofits in Colorado Springs. Billions of dollars of contributions and other revenue is coming into Colorado Springs as a result of those. Not in Colorado Springs, but in El Paso County, Charis Bible College and the Truth and Liberty Coalition. These are the Andrew Womack-led organizations in Woodland Park, also has a significant influence in this area. This is a list. It might be a little bit difficult to see, but these are a list of some of the major, what we have since found out, Christian Nationalist or Christian Nationalist adjacent organizations that call Colorado Springs home. Of course, everyone has heard of Focus on the Family. Compassion International is also based here. Young Life, which has had some issues from an LGBTQ discrimination perspective recently. Navigators is a very secret organization. Navigators owns that part of Garden of the Gods in the Erie Castle that's over there. They ended up buying that entire area. Very, very impressive facilities, a very secretive organization. Waterstone, which I'll talk about here in a little bit. It's a financial management organization that focuses specifically on Christian nationalist organizations. They're just based over on, not research, a little bit further north than that, here in the city. Biblica, this is the company that owns the rights, the licensing to the new international version of the Bible, which is the most popular version of the Bible over the last 10 years, is based here. And then you get into some of the more active Christian nationalist churches in the area. Charis Christian Center, which of course is connected to Andrew Womack. Church for All Nations over on Powers. It's also directly connected to Truth and Liberty and Andrew Womack. Radiant, the Road to Chapel Hills, and Fervent, they're all somehow like part of what we discovered. This is how much activity is going on right here under our noses. And we're going to start getting into what exactly that means and the activity that they've been involved in. But first, we got to go back. We got to go back and we got to talk about what the 7 mountains are. I mean, a lot of you probably initially saw the announcement here, and you didn't really know like what the 7 mountains mandate was. A lot of people don't really know like what that is. The 7 mountains mandate, and I'll talk a little bit more detail, but it is a fuzzy interpretation of some specific passages in the book of Revelation that you have to kind of squint your eyes at a little bit to get this interpretation. But it says that the Christians have to take over and control the 7 spheres of societal influence before the second coming will return. This is what they believe that they have been mandated to do. And these are the 7 mountains: education, religion, family, business, government, arts, entertainment, and media. These are the specific places that they are focused on in order to take over. Once you start distilling these things down into these 7 categories, you probably can immediately start recognizing the influence that you've been seeing. What you might not have known is that it is an incredibly organized, incredibly well-funded effort to take over these particular aspects of society. There's also some realizations that I've had about the dangers of this, because trying to distill our society down into 7 categories could be really dangerous from an intersectional perspective, because none of these things are simple. You can't address things like systemic racism if all you're focused on is distilling society down into 7 categories, as an example. So a lot of this originated back in 1975. This is how long this has been going on. And there were three evangelicals. This is Lauren Cunningham, Bill Bright, and Francis Schaeffer. They supposedly all had a dream delivered by God at the same time. And they happened to be having coffee or something like in a different state from where they lived. They started comparing notes. And wow, isn't it incredible that they all had the same dream at the same time? And in this dream is where it was revealed to them by God that they were supposed to invade and take over those 7 spheres of society. All right, it's kind of fringe thinking, at that time. But then in 2013, this guy who's up here, his name is Lance Wallnau, he published a book called Invading Babylon, the 7 Mountains Mandate, and that's where it started to come back into prominence. And if you're going back in and doing research, you'll see that this is where it really started to be mentioned within the media, and it started to be talked about more. More people started coming out as adherents to the 7 Mountains Mandate. Lance Wallnau is a name that you want to remember. He's incredibly influential within this movement. He's considered to be a prophet of sorts in something called the New Apostolic Reformation, which we'll talk about a little bit later on. I always like to go in and look at like the roots of like where these things originate. So, I have to go into Scripture in order to find out where they're finding the basis of this. The primary basis is in Revelation 17:9. Here is the mind which has wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sits. This is where they're deriving this from, that one simple scripture. And it's commonly, accepted, within the academic community that the book of Revelation was kind of a coded revolutionary text, because the Romans were the ones who were occupying Palestine and Israel at the time. They were speaking in code, and the 7 mountains are referring to the 7 hills of Rome. Is what's generally accepted, but they have taken that and turned it into something completely different. And you have to go into Matthew 28, which is where the order from Jesus came to go into all the nations and make disciples. They're including this in there as well. And then the dominionist part of this comes from Genesis 1:28. Subdue it and have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the fowl of the air, and over every living thing that moveth upon the earth. That is the basis of dominionist theology. So you combine these 3 things up, and you have the 7 Mountains Mandate. This is where they pull it from. All right, so we've only talked about the religious aspects so far, the spiritual origins of the 7 Mountains Mandate. But then right around the same time, I would watch the dates as we're going through my presentation here and start to look at the correlations. Because back in 1970, this is a quote from a guy named Paul Weyrich. This is where the crossover between church and state starts to happen. It's been going on since the 1970s. A lot of people don't know who Paul Weyrich is either. Paul Weyrich could almost be solely and exclusively held responsible for the polarization in our political process right now. He is the one who recognized that evangelicals and Christian conservatives were not voting in large blocks, and there was no distinctive characteristics between Republicans and Democrats back in the 70s. So he had to create a way to provide some distinguishing characteristics. He is the one who invented issue politics. The first thing that he went after was abortion. The Roe versus Wade decision was made in 1973, and he used abortion as that issue in order to motivate and encourage Christian conservatives to show up and vote in large numbers. He's probably almost singularly responsible for Ronald Reagan's election in 1980. I'm going to read this out loud because it's significant. This is a quote from him in 1970. "The new political philosophy must be defined by us, or conservatives, in moral terms, packaged in non-religious language, and propagated throughout the country by our new coalition. When political power is achieved, the moral majority will have the opportunity to recreate this great nation." Everyone remember the moral majority back in the late 1970s. This is where it came from. He was working with people like Jerry Falwell and other evangelical leaders at the time in order to build that political coalition. He created the religious right. He also then founded the Heritage Foundation. He is the originator of that, which we are still experiencing the effects of today. They're the leading conservative think tank in Washington, D.C. A lot of the policies, a lot of the regulations that are promoted by the conservatives originate within the Heritage Foundation. And we'll start seeing some connections to that as we start going through examples of this. So this is where the crossover started. But isn't it interesting, in 1975 is when the Seven Mountains Mandate originated, right around the same time that someone like Paul Weyrich is looking for a way to encourage Christian conservatives to vote in larger numbers. So the first of the mountains, and remember I'm going to give you some examples locally, and then we'll talk about things at a more like national level. The first of these mountains is education. So here, as an example, here in Colorado Springs, there's an organization called Parents Challenge that was founded by Steve Shook and his wife back in the late 1980s, early 1990s. So Steve Shook is very intimate friends with the DeVos family. Betsy DeVos came to Colorado Springs in 2013 for one of the anniversaries of Parents Challenge. Now, Parents Challenge is an organization that seems to be altruistic, on its surface, but they put together, scholarship programs and try to get disenfranchised students out of what they consider to be failing public schools and get them into charter schools and private schools. That's the reason why they exist. But that connection with them, Steve Shook is so connected with the DeVos family that he served as Betsy DeVos's husband's campaign manager whenever he ran for the governor of Michigan back in 1985. They're very, very connected. If you know anything about Betsy DeVos, she's anti-public education, and she's also a dominionist. She wanted to turn the public education system into a way of spreading Christianity. All right, then another local example here is the Benjamin Rush Alliance for Liberty and Education. Melissa and I were actually sitting in Church for All Nations the night that they announced that this organization was being formed. It's ran out of Church for All Nations. Mark Howard, their senior pastor, is one of the leaders of this. He's one of the people that helped found it. It takes a lot to shock me after 12 years of watching this stuff, but my jaw dropped when I was sitting in that auditorium that night because of how blatantly they outline their goals of turning public education in schools into indoctrination centers for religion. This is also where we start to see some of the connections with Andrew Womack and the Truth and Liberty Coalition, Charis Bible College, which is just a few miles away over in Woodland Park. This is going on right here in town. Like I said, just a church over on Powers. Now we jump over and we start looking at some of the national level influences within the education sphere. First person the first person that's really easy to identify is Christopher Rufo, which a lot of people don't know who he is either, but he invented the CRT outrage that started causing so many problems within our public school system. He says it plainly. He said it on Twitter. He said it in interviews with The Atlantic, that he made it up to cause outrage so that when anyone saw something in the newspaper that they didn't like, they would immediately associate that negative feeling with CRT. He made it up. It's complete propaganda. At the time that he did this, he was a fellow with the Heritage Foundation. That's when we start seeing some connections here, and how they are using these umbrella organizations to accomplish their goals. Moms for Liberty has also been in the news, quite a bit lately. They are starting to, they came out of Florida. They call themselves a grassroots organization, except that they made their announcement that they were forming themselves as an organization on the Rush Limbaugh program. That's not really grassroots. You don't start that way. They are also funded and supported by the Heritage Foundation. So it's two different things. This is complete propaganda coming out of the Heritage Foundation. It's being promoted by people like Christopher Rufo. It's being promoted by organizations like Moms for Liberty, specifically to tear down the public education system. Let's move on to the religion sphere. This guy who's sitting over here on the right-hand side, that is former Arkansas State Senator Jason Rapert. I wanted to include him because he's kind of how I got my start. He used Koch money back in 2012 to flip Arkansas was the last of the southern states to flip to Republican back in 2012. He did that with Koch money. The very first thing that he did was he pushed and passed a heartbeat bill. Arkansas was the fourth state back in 2013 to pass a heartbeat bill. But then he also started doing a whole bunch of other separation of church violations, like the Ten Commandments monument that he passed legislation to place it on the Arkansas State House grounds. I mention this because the goal of taking over the religion sphere is to establish a specific form of Christianity as at the top of the pyramid. They want Christianity to be the primary religious influence around the world. This is where you start to see the myth of the Judeo-Christian tradition as an example. They have to establish those types of things as truth in order to establish themselves as the primary religious influence. There's also an organization, too, called the National Association of Evangelicals. Have you ever noticed that within evangelical communities, their doctrine, the messages that they push, the things that they are concerned about, all seem to be very consistent? You're always hearing like the same thing, from all of them. Well, that's because they're very tightly organized and regulated by organizations like the National Association of Evangelicals. It's a very large organization. It has hundreds of thousands of members, around the United States. But the connection to Colorado Springs is that their president was, for a long time, was Ted Haggard, which all of you know he was a senior pastor of New Life for quite a long time. So all of these types of things are the ways that they are establishing control over the religious sphere. From a family perspective, taking over the family mountain, what they're doing is they're trying to establish the traditional views, the traditional interpretations, and traditional interpretations of family. The so-called nuclear family, where there's a man and a woman who are married, they have kids, the man goes off to work, the woman stays home and takes care of the kids. That's their definition of family. They go to church every Sunday, that type of thing. So in order to take over that mountain, they have to make that the most common definition of family, even though we all know that that's not true. There's all different kinds of definitions of family. And a local example of that was back in 1992 with the passage of Colorado Amendment 2. A lot of people in this room probably know what Amendment 2 was. That's where it was in our state constitution that prevented cities and localities from passing anti-discrimination laws that protected people based on sexual orientation. Colorado became the hate state very quickly after that, and it wasn't actually ever enforced. That was all promoted by Focus on the Family and some other conservative evangelical leaders here in Colorado Springs. That was one of the very first things that Focus on the Family, the exercise that they tried to implement within a local area after they moved from California. They were very, very heavily involved in that. So they have to do things like this in order to establish their definition of family as the one that is correct. The Family Research Council, moving to the national level now, they were founded in 1981. They have a very large office here that's actually co-located with Focus on the Family. They're primarily over on K Street in Washington, D.C. They're a lobbying organization for all intents and purposes. Everything that they do, and they're the organization where you would start to see censoring of music, censoring of movies, They go through these fads and phases about things that are concerning to them periodically, but they are also heavily influential within the legislative community. In the business sphere, this is the one where I've probably been like the most shocked, and it's also the hardest to find out information about it and how they're exercising influence here. You have to have like a special kind of mind to do financial analysis, and that's what this requires. What I'm showing over here on the right-hand side is a financial statement from that organization I mentioned earlier called Waterstone. Waterstone is a financial planning organization. It's one of many. You've actually probably all seen ads recently that were influenced by one of these donor-advised funds. We'll talk about that in a minute because you might be surprised. Waterstone is based here. This is their March of 2022 statement. They had over $700 million in assets, and they are one of many. The other one that I listed up here, the Signatory, has billions of dollars in these things called donor-advised funds. Donor-advised funds it's like a mutual fund for charitable organizations with one specific exception, that whoever is donating this money can retain the rights to dictate how that money is spent. Waterstone, I saw the website. Their donation forms are actually connected to one of the 7 mountains. A very wealthy donor, wanted to influence the government sphere, the education sphere. The donation forms themselves were tagged that way. And you wouldn't notice that unless you knew what the 7 mountains were. That's very interesting. It's based here. I was surprised to find out that there's actually like even larger ones. This is billions and billions of dollars of completely dark money coming in from very wealthy individuals if they want to exercise influence over one of these 7 mountains. So they have to be able to have money in order to be able to do some of the things that they're doing. This is how they're doing it, and it's all completely obscure because of tax law. There are some things like the Kingdom Business Association and the International Christian Chamber of Commerce. These are a little bit more obscure too. They don't seem to be all that really big or influential, with the exception of the fact that it's interesting that these Christian business leaders have found the need to set up their own organizations for networking and training. Also, kingdom is a key word. If you see kingdom of God, revolution, that's code for 7 mountains. There's several different types of these keywords that are found, throughout this movement. Moving on to arts and entertainment, this was where you may have seen a lot of the influence. I mean, a lot of people probably heard of the film God's Not Dead that Kevin Sorbo was in. That was produced by a company called Pinnacle Peak Pictures. Facing the Giants, it's actually a pretty decent football movie until you get to the proselytizing. And then Fireproof Kirk Cameron, that was a feature that was actually very well produced. Those are done by Sherwood Films. Sherwood Films is ran out of a church in South Carolina. 2,000 Mules, I mean, a lot of you probably heard about that. A pseudo-documentary that Dinesh D'Souza had put out, just encouraging the election integrity and election safety types of things that were going on over the last couple of years. That was produced by a company called Salem Media Group. They do have a pretty large presence in Colorado. Salem Media Group is also doing, they're buying up AM radio stations left and right, and they have been for a long time. What's the primary reason? Who listens to AM radio stations these days? If that gives you any kind of indication of why they're moving down that path. They are able to produce these films probably with a lot of contributions, a lot of donations from their church members. They're able to produce these things on shoestring budgets and then make millions of dollars off of them and then promote their message like all at the same time. Not directly connected to the religious side, but Dinesh D'Souza, he made $1 million in 12 hours off of 2,000 Mules by publishing it on his Rumble channel, which there aren't even very many people on that platform. And we get over into a little bit more of like the mainstream things. I mean, if you have kids, if you have grandkids, I mean, chances are, they're on TikTok. Chances are they're on Instagram. And they probably, if you ask them who Miranda Derrick was, they're probably going to tell you who she is. They probably know. She's a very, very popular viral dancer on both of those platforms. But there was some, she disappeared, went in no contact with her family whenever she moved out to California to start working for and it blew my mind whenever I saw this, to start working for 7M Films. That is a 7M organization. You wouldn't notice it, by the videos and things that they produce, working with viral creators like Miranda Derrick, but it's a Seven Mountain Christian Dominionist organization, and they kind of treat their staff. It's almost like a cult where they're encouraging their creators to distance themselves from their families so they can concentrate on the work. Oh, it's there hiding in plain sight, and no one would have ever known it unless they started digging into who was actually doing this. The media sphere, I mentioned before that you probably saw some ads recently that was influenced and paid for by one of those Christian DAFs that I mentioned during the business sphere. If you saw all the He Gets Us ads during the Super Bowl, the different things that, different ads that have been placed for He Gets Us, on social media and around the internet, that's actually funded by the Signatory. That was one of the DAFs that I'd mentioned before, one of the more wealthy ones. You would never know it unless you started looking at the sources of the funding. Focus on the Family actually runs something a lot of people don't know about. I didn't know about it until I was doing research about this 2 or 3 months ago. They run a site called the Daily Citizen. The Daily Citizen is actually where a lot of the conservative and Republican talking points that you hear on the news, that you hear in Congress, it's where it originates. I've started following the Daily Citizen since then, and you can see how the messages they start pushing there will start ending up on Fox News or starting to come out of the mouths of conservative politicians a couple of days later. They are creating the media narrative from within Focus on the Family in a lot of ways. Christian Broadcasting Network, a lot of people, you probably heard of that. Pat Robertson started that, back in the late 70s, early 1980s. But it's become so prominent. So whenever a new president is elected, shortly after their inauguration, it's a big deal to be the first news organization to get that first one-on-one interview with the new president. So whenever Donald Trump was elected and he was inaugurated in 2017, then the first media interview was given to ABC News, David Muir. Second one was given to Sean Hannity. That shouldn't be a surprise to anybody. Third one was given to a guy I'd never heard of called David Brody from the Christian Broadcasting Network. The Christian Broadcasting Network got the third one-on-one interview with a new president of the United States. It's how influential, that this has become, how much the conservative politicians are pandering to the Christian community. David Brody also left Focus on the Family to go and work for Christian Broadcasting Network, which is also interesting. I already talked about He Gets Us, but then these are a couple of obscure things. As I was doing all this research, you've heard all the conservatives complaining about being deplatformed, being demonetized, being censored on platforms like YouTube and Twitter and those at least until recently, those types of platforms. But how are they spreading their message in spite of all of that? As I was doing research about these churches, I started seeing these references. I had to go into the code of the website in order to see these things. I kept on seeing something called Subsplash. I'm like, well, these are very well produced, large video platforms. They can't be doing this locally. Church for All Nations is not doing what they do locally with their own systems. Started doing some research, and there is a full-featured YouTube equivalent called Subsplash, managed by the Subsplash company in Washington State, that exists almost solely to provide YouTube-like capabilities to religious organizations. And it's primarily used by evangelical organizations. So they found a way to make money off of the fact that these creators can't keep their message on the more common platforms. And then have you ever noticed, you can be impressed, with a message and marketing material that you see without agreeing with the message. And a lot of what these churches are putting out, these days, it's very, very impressive. It looks very slick. It looks very commercial. And a lot of that is because of a company called Digifora. Digifora was founded by the two people who are responsible for the graphic social media content for Lakewood Church. I can never remember that guy's name. The smiles all the time. He's a pastor of Lakewood Church. They took over the sports arena in Houston. What? Yeah, Joel Osteen. I don't know why I can never remember his name. Maybe I'm just erasing it. The two people that founded Digifora were responsible for all the social media and graphic content for his church. And now they provide it for a lot of people. It's a multi-million-dollar business now. And we get over into the one that it concerns me the most, that I've spent the most time researching. That's the government sphere. And this is where a lot of what we are experiencing on a daily basis, this is where all of this starts to come into focus. Locally, I've already mentioned the Truth and Liberty Coalition. We're going to talk about them specifically here in just a minute. But that is an organization that exists specifically. They even say it, that how they'll run a tagline before they start playing a video. In that tagline for the Truth and Liberty Coalition, they say that they believe that they have a mandate to take over the 7 mountains of society. Better? Okay. That's managed just over in Woodland Park. Keep on getting some feedback, Rob. How many people have heard of the leadership program of the Rockies? Have you ever heard of LPR? So many of the conservative politicians, community leaders in Colorado are alumni of something called the Leadership Program of the Rockies. It's a networking group, but it's also a way for conservatives to train new conservative leaders in traditional forms of government. And whenever they talk about traditional or classical, what they really mean is a Judeo-Christian, generally white-centric type of government. It's a major program like here in Colorado. It was founded, one of the people who founded it was also Steve Shook. A lot of people don't know that either, which we've already mentioned his name. That's where a lot of the cooperation, it's where a lot of the ideas for even legislation that we experience and that we see in the General Assembly today, it's where it originates. Now, this is part of the taking over the government sphere locally. And then we go into some other national level things, and there's an organization called United in Purpose. This was one of the more interesting things that I was doing some research on. How many people have ever done canvassing for Democrats? And you use something called Vote Builder or VAN? Okay, United in Purpose is kind of the equivalent of that. A guy named Ken Eldred, who is also a prominent leader. He's a Silicon Valley businessman. He founded a lot of companies, ended up selling them. He's made a lot of money off of that. He's the one who kind of started United in Purpose with some other people. United in Purpose is like VAN, it's like Vote Builder, except that the place that they get their voter data from comes from church rolls. They're scraping and collecting the membership rolls of evangelical churches in order to populate that. And then they then have applications that are part of that they can give to pastors. So the pastors can compare their membership rolls with voter registration data that they collect locally, so they can see which members of their flock are actually registered to vote and influence them in certain ways. That was interesting. United in Purpose also ended up gathering a lot of voter data because they established a lot of the events, the Stop the Steal rallies, the other election integrity events that we all saw over the last couple of years. They were the ones who were behind that, and they did that for a reason. So they would establish these events on Facebook. They would see who would sign up to go to RSVP to go, and they could make some assumptions about the type of voter that was, and then include that in the UIP database. That's out there. And then Wall Builders. Wall Builders founded by a guy named David Barton. David Barton is also part of the Truth and Liberty Coalition. He's very closely connected with Andrew Womack. He's a pseudo-historian, if you don't know, and the reason why I say pseudo is because he's so bad at it that his own publisher pulled a couple of his books for plagiarism and for incorrect information. He is basically trying to reinvent American history with that Judeo-Christian origin myth story. They're getting into writing school curriculum now too. Just keep that in the back of your mind. And they call us indoctrinators. These are a couple of the Truth and Liberty influencers. I'm sure you know who both of these people are. Truth and Liberty has several different people that they refer to as influencers that are a formal part of their organization. It's pushing their message and carrying out their agenda. Lauren Boebert and Doug Lamborn are two of them. This is a quote from Lauren Boebert back in June of 2022. The church is supposed to direct the government. The government is not supposed to direct the church. I'm tired of this separation of church and state junk. It's not in the Constitution. It was in a stinking letter. It means nothing like what they say it does. This is 2022 at a church on the Western Slope. Then we get over to something a lot more local because this is our representative in Congressional District 5. We appreciate the fact that Steve, he's talking about Steve Holt, the pastor of the Road Church. This is when he was speaking at an event at the Road Church back in 2022, wants the 7 mountains of society to be taken over for the Lord. Isn't that interesting? Our elected congressional representative is saying that he wants the 7 mountains to be taken over, and a lot of people didn't even know what the 7 mountains were. These are all of their influencers. This is hard to see. You should go and visit the Truth and Liberty Coalition website just to look at the list of all of their influencers. There are some very surprising names on this list. There are some people, who are not all that surprising, but there are a lot of current and former legislators that are on this list. Dennis Heisey is on this list. I thought that was interesting too. Dennis Heisey is a former state representative, state senator here locally in Colorado Springs. They are incredibly influential, I guess is the point, and you should do some more research on your own and see who is actually connected to this. If they show up on this influencer list, then they are 7 Mountains Dominionists. There's no question. But all of this has to have like some kind of like umbrella organizations, right? I mean, they're not doing all of this, just being like loosely connected. That wouldn't work like in that way. So there are some umbrella organizations you should all be aware of too. The first one I've already mentioned, which is the New Apostolic Reformation. This is a quasi-organized set of evangelical and spiritual leaders who are pushing this agenda, this doctrine from the church pulpits. They have prophets, they have teachers. They're setting up the very traditional organization of the church the way that they think that it existed as part of Paul's ministry to the Gentiles. Everybody knew, I'm thinking, that you probably saw Paula White, the woman who's pictured here hanging around Trump. You're getting back in the 2015, 2016 time frame. She was his spiritual advisor. She's a pastor of a big megachurch down in Florida. But what most people didn't know was that she is considered a prophet in the New Apostolic Reformation and works directly with people like Lance Wallnau, like Andrew Womack, and the other people who are involved in that movement. That's how, but look at the picture. That's how closely the New Apostolic Reformation was to the President of the United States. Heritage Foundation is also considered an umbrella organization. This is where the policies, the regulations, the model legislation, types of things that come from, and also, as I've already shown, a lot of propaganda that supports this. And the last one, the big overall, if you want to talk about an overarching umbrella, is an organization called the Council for National Policy. A lot of people haven't heard that either. If you have seen the documentary on Netflix called The Family, and you're starting to get a little bit of exposure to what CNP is. CNP was founded in 1981. Has anybody heard of the Left Behind series of books? The author, Tim LaHaye, he founded the Council for National Policy back in 1981. There's been a couple of movies about that too. One of them with Kirk Cameron that wasn't very good, another one with Nicolas Cage that was even worse, so don't bother. But he's the one that founded that. Council for National Policy has become so influential that Jenny Thomas is now one of the leaders, Clarence Thomas's wife. We don't even really know how big it is because much like Fight Club, the new members are instructed to not even mention the name of the organization. And every now and then there'll be some leaks about their membership list and that kind of stuff. They don't even announce like where they're going to be meeting until a couple of weeks in advance. But it's very, very large gatherings. You can name any of the most influential politicians, evangelical leaders, and unfortunately millionaires and billionaires, and they're probably all organizing and working together underneath that CMP umbrella. Of all of like the things that we're talking about here, go and do some research on your own about the Council for National Policy. Ralph Reed, he was the head of the Christian Coalition, which was a spinoff of the Moral Majority back in the 90s. This is where we're going to start getting into what can we do, what are their ultimate goals, and what can we do about it. This is a quote: "I would rather have 1,000 school board members than one president and no school board members." If everyone saw what happened here in El Paso County back in 2021, this should really, really resonate with you. There's a reason why even people like Steve Bannon were saying that the next place the conservative movement needed to focus on was school boards and city councils, okay? And I want you to notice when he said this, 1996. They are playing a very, very long game. They started with abortion back in 1973. 50 years later, they got it overturned. They are patient, and they're playing a long strategic game. And if we aren't paying attention to and starting to recognize these patterns in these organizations, we will get caught by it. And it won't matter, I appreciate the fact that, all of you are here like on a Sunday morning practicing your religious beliefs, right? But you're not part of this. You're not a Christian nationalist, therefore you are just as much of an enemy as I am. So what can we do? I've been talking a lot about this particular piece lately, and this is going to sound political, but it's not. The solution to this, I believe, is actually very, very simple. And the reason why they've been able to take over our school boards and our city councils, state legislators, and that kind of thing is because we're letting them. We are opening up the doors and we are letting the extremists in. You know how we're doing that? 2021, we've got a city council and mayoral election coming up right now. We're going to be voting, here in the next few days. We have to have our ballots returned. Let me clarify. In the 2021 election, the city election, the turnout was 27%. Almost a quarter. That's all. We left the doors wide open for these types of people to come in and take over these things. Academy District School, ASD 20 election in 2021 had a 41% turnout. District 49 had a 31% turnout. District 11 had 34% turnout. Now what happened? Who took advantage of that low turnout? It was those non-conservative candidates that got me started down this path of doing all this research in the first place. And you think about what they've done, especially in D11, especially in D49. You think about what they've done. We opened the doors and we let them in because we didn't show up and we didn't vote. Even if we were voting, in Denver, I prepared this originally for a group up in Denver. Denver County had an 18% turnout in 2021 elections, 18%, right? We can't continue doing this and expect for anything to be different. We have to, and here in Colorado, we have no excuse. It's the easiest place in the world to vote. You don't have to go anywhere. You fill out your ballot, put it in the mail, you're done. Easy. There's no excuse for it. But if we don't start changing this, because see, if we actually, even if we just had midterm election results, not presidential, midterm election results, I might not even have to be standing here because there would have been no space for them to move into. But we're allowing it. We're allowing the space. So we have to acknowledge that this is information warfare. Our minds are constantly being played with, by all the propaganda that's being pushed from organizations like the Heritage Foundation, and then it's being amplified like at the local level. We have to acknowledge that this is what's going on. And it's not fun, it's not the greatest, thing to discover and do research, but we have to. We have to start equipping ourselves for the fight that we're in. We have to realize that, we all focus on presidential elections and presidential decisions, but we have to realize that that's not where the problems are occurring anymore. Donald Trump can get up and say, whatever ridiculous things that he wants to. It doesn't really have all that much of an impact except on the national discussion. The real problems are happening in school boards, city councils, state legislatures. The local level is where this is happening. It's where we have to pay the most attention. We also have to understand that there is no violation, and I say this all the time. I am actively involved with Freedom from Religion Foundation. One of their primary focuses is helping people like me, helping people like all of you with filing violation reports, because of separation of church violations. And what I hear all the time from people who understand this stuff fundamentally and appreciate pluralism is oh, it's not that big of a deal. We have to stop saying that, because every time we say that, it chips away. It's one more step towards the things that I've been describing. So no violation is too small to ignore. Something else that also happens quite often in progressive communities is gatekeeping. The beautiful thing, about being part of a progressive community is we all have opinions and we're all very passionate about them. That can cause problems sometimes. The right does not have that problem. They are very, very singularly focused, where we value a diverse set of opinions, but that can also cause us problems. That also causes gatekeeping. That's why I'm here, why Melissa is sitting in the front row, is because we are completely and 100% open with everything that we find out. Anything that we discover through research, we will make openly available, because this is what we have to do in order to get the word out and for everyone to be informed. So if you ever find yourself holding on to your rice bowl about something that's your area of specialty or something that you have discovered, just remember that you're hurting. You're hurting this cause if you're doing that. And then we just have to go vote. We have to increase turnout in local elections. If we increase that's the primary thing, the easiest way that we could do to shut a lot of this down in its tracks. If we show up to vote, we're electing like reasonable people, like into these elections. We're not leaving the gate wide open for the extremists to come in. A lot of this stuff becomes much, much more difficult for them. And then we can solve like some of those problems. I know that was probably a pretty depressing and sobering thing to talk about like on a Sunday morning, but I do sincerely appreciate you allowing me to come and talk to you. I didn't go too far over, did I?
Hello? Yeah.
Hi.
I just wanted to ask clarification. When you say Koch money, you're talking about the billionaire Koch brothers, aren't you?
Yes.
Who, by the way, are influencing a lot of what's being funded on PBS now.
Yes. Those same ones, not Coca-Cola and cute polar bears.
Any other questions? Judith.
You didn't mention race at all, and in our forum series last year, we had James Mason, who was formerly the 11 school board president, and he gave a talk, kind of the history of integration in the South, and he ended with a really chilling statement that he was very much afraid that as the census continues to document the sort of decrease of white population, he was sincerely afraid that we were going to have a race war. And I noticed that in all the organizations that you talked about, you didn't talk anything about this issue of race. And I'm wondering if you think that has a particular impact or importance.
That's a good point. I think I probably excluded it because I just find it inherent. Probably like Jim mentioned, the charter school concepts, the concept of school vouchers came out of segregation in the South. So the race aspect is inherent to all of this, and it's also one of the reasons. Now, I don't think this would take a lot of analysis and research in order to really determine, but I think that's why a lot of this activity has actually been accelerated over the last few years, because they realize that while they've been playing a long strategic game, they're running out of time, because it's not just the percentage of the population that's white that is in decline. It's also the percentage of the population that identifies as Christian. So you combine those two things. I mean, the Pew Research annual report came out in September, and I was actually even shocked at how quickly the decline was accelerating, because now it's 63% of the United States that identifies as some form of Christian. 63%. That's a dramatic decline, over the previous 10 years. So they see the writing on the wall. They're not going to be a majority from a race perspective. They're not going to be a majority from a religious perspective. They have to do something now. They have. And is it going to be, outright, traditional dictatorship? I mean, I don't think so, because we're a very capitalist society, and we need people to be still spending money. It's going to be much more authoritarian, of the likes of the things that we're seeing in Florida now with Ron DeSantis. But it is a good point. I should probably update this to mention that specifically, but I think it's just because it's so inherent to it in my mind, because so much of this originated with Brown versus Board of Education in 1954 and the backlash to that. And then, I grew up in Arkansas too, so, Little Rock Central High School, was very, very familiar, in my brain. It's just, I've never considered it to be anything other than a race problem too.
Yeah, you were talking about what I was thinking as you were talking, which is even though freedom is in all their stuff, they're moving away from democracy and freedom towards authoritarianism in order to be able to accomplish this, because they are not in the majority, right?
I've been saying that phrase a lot, especially here in Colorado Springs and El Paso County. I think it's important for us to realize we are the majority. The majority of people do not agree with these authoritarian, anti-democratic principles. The majority of people want you to be able to love and marry whomever it is that you want to. The majority of people want you to be able to worship however it is that you want. They are the anomaly. They are the minority. We are the majority. We just have to stand up and be as loud as they are. It's really what it comes down to.
Hi, I'm Deborah Benting, and I've been following this stuff since the 70s. Lauren Cunningham founded the evangelical mission that I was part of for many years, and I've interviewed him on this. I've written papers on this topic and produced videos and stuff, and I just want to say that, you know, they call it the discipling nations is kind of the term that we ended up on, and it really comes from a deep conviction that God wants to build a kingdom on earth. And so it's the evangelicals' job to make that happen. And, you know, these 7 areas of influence are, you know, you can see them in different ways. You can see them as influence, or you can see them as takeovers. And even within this area, there's not all groupthink. It's not all the same. Some really want to do it kind of take over, but then there's other people that are like, no, these are the areas of influence, so I want to become a film producer so that I can make films that influence people. You use some pretty strong language, and obviously I'm not in that world anymore, or I wouldn't be here, but you talk about regulated. I don't know if there's so much regulated as there's this idea that this is what it is to be a Christian, that you can't be gay and be a Christian, you can't be trans, you can't want an abortion, you know, like all these things. So it's very, very fine parameters. Censorship maybe, but it's almost like groupthink that's kind of can be very cult-like. I just want to say that not everybody is out to dominate and to be authoritarian, and there's a lot of conversation in this. And what does it mean for God to build his kingdom on earth? So I think there's some good hearts. There's also some controlling people who have, you know, issues. I did my master's and PhD at CBN University, Christian Broadcasting Network, now called Regent University. And even then, back in '89, when I graduated with my master's, there was one professor that was let go because he was too far down this road. So there's a lot of conversation, a lot of complexity. So let's just not be super judgmental to where we put everybody in the awful category like Fox News does to the rest of the world.
Absolutely, and I 100% agree with you. It is not all Christians. It's not all evangelicals. And that was my point of this is not to characterize anyone into like a singular bucket, because there isn't one. And there are a lot of people, you know, who think that they're doing like a good thing by influencing things in certain ways. I just had someone tell me a couple of nights ago that they were looking out for me by trying to influence government in using biblical principles because it was good for me too. And I sincerely think that they believed that. I don't agree with that, but they believe it, and their heart like is in the right place. It's the leadership that I do blame. The leadership of this is where I do place a lot of the responsibility.
My name is Nancy Hingham, and I sit on City Council. Nancy Hingham, I sit on City Council in Colorado Springs for District 5. First of all, I want to say it's not appropriate for me to share with you right now who I think you shouldn't be voting for in this election, but I'm more than happy to talk with anybody if you'd like to hear who I voted for and my thoughts on where different candidates fall along these lines. I'm happy to talk with you afterwards or communicate via phone. I'm very concerned. And I also have to say, maybe along the lines of what you were saying, Deb, as I was sitting listening to Leanne's sermon this morning, I was thinking about one of my fellow council members in particular, and how to love them, given how they show up in the ideology that we're so afraid of, that I'm so afraid of. And so I'm convicted by that. and how we find the conviction and stay in the belief of what is right while also being in conversation with those with whom we're very, very diametrically opposed in some of these values. It's very challenging on the front lines, I'm going to tell you. In fact, as I was sitting here, I was texting someone who shared with me the other day who they voted for. And I was shocked. And this is somebody I just completely, I could not believe, one of the city council people that they voted for. And I was texting them here and sending information. And then I thought, well, crap, did I just make this person feel terrible? And realized I actually don't know how they feel about particular, I mean, you know, just the connections, connecting the dots. And I then texted them back and said, boy, and if I've made some assumptions here, let's have a conversation, and my apologies, and I don't want to share this with you to make you feel bad about your vote, but I'm petrified serving with this person on council. So it's complicated. It's very complicated, and I appreciate this very much and learning, and I think for all of us doing the deeper research is something we all need to do, and getting that goddamn vote out. I mean, we should all be out knocking doors right now is what we really should be doing. And I think some people are leaving here to go do that, so yay.
I just wanted to share one short comment. I was in Italy 5 years ago, and I met a 25-year-old woman who was teaching underground because they had banned all the books about World War II, Nazism and Mussolini in Italy 5 years ago. And I was shocked that she was teaching history underground. And I think that's where we're headed if we don't wake up.
I was wondering if the leadership group has a headquarters on 8th Street. There's a big building near Brookside that I've been told is for leadership training. And there are not many people there. It's a huge building up on the hill. And it may not have anything to do with that, but I know that they had mentioned that there's leadership training.
But the Pinery?
I wondered if you have anything to say about Larry Arnn or Hillsdale College. Their monthly letters or mailings, which I get partly to make them a poorer organization, but I do read them, and it's disturbing and resonates with a lot of what you said.
It's part of it. I mean, it's part of the effort, you know, either from an education perspective or from a government perspective. It's part of it. I mean, Heritage, CMP, there's a organization within CMP called the Blackwell Institute that's heavily involved in influencing all of that too. It's one and the same.
Right. If there are no other questions,
Hillsdale is
sorry.
Hillsdale is incredibly insidious. Go ahead.
Yes, please.
You know, when we were doing the research and Rob put this together, oh, I apologize. Okay, I'm just really not good with these things. When we were doing research and Rob put this together, we needed to recognize that we needed to make this palatable. It's a lot and it's overwhelming. But there's something that you need to understand about Seven Mountains and what is called the New Apostolic Reformation specifically. New Apostolic Reformation is a cross between Pentecostal and evangelicalism that they've reinvented in a way. And it is the Pentecostal form of speaking in tongues. It is the Pentecostal form of literally saying, I had a dream, I spoke with God, and he has said that that's not true what's in the Bible, and I'm going to rewrite it. I'm going to tell my congregation that this is what needs to happen now. So they are in a way utilizing their form of religion to rewrite what they believe the Bible should say in real time. And on top of it, they are literally attacking other religions in real time. So if they were to get a larger power, they could literally send letters to this congregation, etc., and say, you can't teach that version of the Bible. They have declared that in Judaism, that it is considered genital mutilation to get circumcised. And Moms for Liberty is actually pushing that right now. They are literally making everyone adhere to the 7 mountains and the New Apostolic. And they're going to continue to push that. So. Oh, is it okay?
I just wanted to say, as long as we're depressing everybody, I talked to a friend of mine who's doing ballot running during the election, and we are up to, in Colorado Springs, a whopping 9% of people that have voted so far.
Well, people vote by mail. It's just 9% of people vote by mail.
Hi, my name is Alvin Sexton. So I met Rob about 1.5 years ago, and Rob has really impacted my life in so many ways. He's really made me think about my, my past. So to give you a little idea, I'm from the South too, in East Tennessee. It is a deep red Republican city, state.
10-4.
Yeah, very in the middle of the Bible Belt. And I like to talk about my dad a lot. I lost him a couple years ago, and I didn't really appreciate him enough when I had him. And I want to tell you all a story about when I brought my wife home. She's Hispanic. And I brought her home to meet a couple members of my family, and one of my religious family members made the comment that, hey, we shouldn't be race mixing, and that really hurt me, because this person who said it, I really loved them a lot. But my dad stood up and said, hey, it doesn't matter who you are, it doesn't matter the color of your skin, love is love. He was a Christian, and that was what I was brought up with, that kind of Christianity. And as I was going to church when I was younger, people would say, hey, if you're gay, you're going to hell. Or, hey, if you believe this, you're going to hell. And that really hurt me, because my brother's gay, my cousin is gay, and I care for those people a lot. And that really drove me away from the church for so many years. And it was actually recently I met a person. His name's Father Caleb, and he told me that the love of Jesus does not hate anybody. If anybody tells you that Jesus requires you to hate anybody, do not listen to them. And we got into like an hour-long conversation, and it was just so refreshing to hear that. And that's something that I really want to drive home today, is just because you're a Christian, you don't have to be a Christian nationalist. We can stand up to these people. A real-life example of what's happening here is, anybody heard the name Gordon Klingenschmidt? Yes, exactly. He is running for office again. He has no place. Another person, has anybody heard of? Yeah, so if you don't know anything about him, he says that he performs gay exorcisms. That is the kind of person he is. And then we just had a pastor elected out in eastern Colorado Springs. Have you heard of Scott Bottoms? Anybody here at all? Well, he was recently elected to the State House of Representatives, and he said that if you're gay, it's because of demons, and you need to go and pray before God, and so you can get the demons out of your body. We elected him because people didn't show up in the midterm elections. This is happening here. Just in Tennessee, they just introduced a state law that is going to ban same-sex marriage based on your religious beliefs. So if the county clerk says, no, I identify as a Christian and this is not right to me, I'm not going to marry you, they can do that. Obviously, it's against the law, and they want to take that to the Supreme Court. That is, my guess, and Rob can probably elaborate on this in the radicalization of the Supreme Court later on, because that's probably a long topic. But this is happening right in front of our eyes, everybody. Please, everybody, get out and vote, be involved, tell your friends. Thank you.
We are also called to love them. And so we have to do that too, right? So how do we respond in a Christ-like way and not in the same spirit that they're coming after some of us?
Well, we have gone long over, so thank you all for staying with us for Forum, and thank you to Rob Rogers and company for bringing this to us. I'm sure that if you'd like to ask him more questions afterwards, he'll probably be willing. Thank you.